Listed among the 40 smartest people in healthcare by Becker's Hospital Review, Dr. Neel Shah has spent the past decade at Harvard Medical School serving as an obstetrician gynecologist. His work focuses on improving healthcare and addressing disparities in care. From the John Oliver Show and PBS to Oprah Winfrey's new Smithsonian Channel documentary, The Color of Care, Dr. Shah is on a mission to expose and address America's racial inequities in healthcare. I sit down with him, coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Good morning and welcome, Dr. Shah.
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning.
First of all, just congratulations on the great work that you've been doing with the documentary we were going to talk about, The Color of Care, but also Aftershock, the other documentary that you are intimately involved in. How does it feel to have your work around healthcare disparities be literally displayed to an international audience?
It's a mix of things. Obviously it's a little nerve-wracking to be on screens, but it's also really validating. Like you said, this has been a decade of effort, and this is an issue. Racial inequality in healthcare and maternal mortality specifically has been an academic discussion, and now it's being platformed by the White House and Oprah Winfrey. So of course that's great.
Yeah, we're going to talk about both of the documentaries. I'll start with The Color of Care. Just what was it like working with Oprah on a project, like you said, that traditionally has been talked about in medical schools and law schools and other graduate schools, but now someone like her with such a huge platform has taken an interest in this topic. What was it like working with her?
Yeah, I mean, to be totally honest with you, I didn't know Oprah was involved until after I sat down for the interview. The person who reached out was Yance Ford, who was the director. And Yance is a trans man who was nominated for an Academy Award for his film Stronger Island, about his brother who was murdered by police for which there was no justice. So he is a serious artist and a serious person. And he reached out to me after there was a New York Times article on what Black mothers in particular were facing in New York City at the height of the pandemic. And there's an article that quoted me and also featured my friend Bruce McIntyre, who lost his partner, Amber Isaac. And I didn't think I was going to be in the film when I talked to Yance. Actually, both films, I expected to be in the background. My job is usually just to try to be as helpful as I can as an academic. But, if it's not apparent already, like the screen is not my comfort zone. So I was surprised when Yance asked me to be on camera. And even then I was hesitant because, I'm melanated. So I've got a little bit of perspective on racism in America and more broadly, but, I don't have the lived experience of being a Black mom. And so I wasn't sure I was the right person. But Yance ended up drawing a lot out of me and ended up saying things on camera that I'd really never said publicly before. And everyone will get to see it in a couple weeks. So.
Yeah, we know that The Color of Care aired on the Smithsonian Channel. And I was struck by what Oprah Winfrey said she was struck by. She said she had read a report about the disparities related to COVID during the height. And she said some of the stuff she read literally stopped her in her tracks. She talked about this man, Gary Fowler, who died in his home because no one would treat him despite his COVID-19 symptoms. So Oprah was struck by that. And I remember spending months at the beginning of the pandemic interviewing families myself who talked about sitting for hours in hospital waiting rooms and watching white families be taken back to beds and be examined by doctors, but Black families having to sit for hours. How unique are the stories that were told in The Color of Care? Because on one hand, people may think these are, just anomalies. But from my work, and I'm sure from yours, there's a different story.
No, absolutely. I think every person of color is aware of the differences in which they're treated in everyday life, and healthcare isn't immune from that by any means. But I think the thing about the pandemic that was really, really remarkable is that it took people's full context and what was happening to them biologically, and it just collided everything in these really stark terms. Like I was in Boston at the height of the pandemic, and the hardest hit city was the city of Chelsea on the outskirts of Boston. And people would call me on the phone while I was on call as an obstetrician with symptoms of COVID-19. And if they didn't meet the criteria on my sheet for coming into the hospital, I would tell them to just isolate at home. And it was because we were trying to keep people out of the hospital. It was well intended. But the whole reason they were infected in the first place is because they couldn't self-isolate. They were living in multi-generational housing. They were driving buses. That things like that were happening all the time. Right. And of course, they felt dismissed by me when I was like, stay home. And then they would come in, and then they wouldn't be able to bring their loved ones in with them. And it just created this whole cycle where it was really challenging for them to advocate for themselves.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Dr. Shah, that you're melanated, but you obviously are not African-American. You're obviously not an African-American woman. But what do you think, what do you think about your training, or what is it about your training and your experiences that allow you to speak to the issues that African-Americans, and particularly African-American women, experience as it relates to access to healthcare and treatment by the healthcare system?
I mean, I think honestly, we're all products of our environment. And so I think, I don't know. I mean, to be totally honest with you, I think I never thought I was going to be an obstetrician. And then in medical school, you get to deliver babies, and like, unless you have no soul, you're like, well, that's cool. I like want to be around for things like this. But then really what it was, especially as a dude in my mid-20s, was I, like, for the first time saw what people with a uterus go through. And I've been following that curiosity ever since. And then I became a public health professor, and I did not understand how it's possible that a person today in the United States is 50% more likely to die in childbirth than her own mother, and 3 to 4 times more likely to die if she's Black. I just wanted to understand what was going on. And it's impossible to understand this without looking at it through the lens of racial equity and without questioning the ways in which we're trained and the environment it's sort of like that fish and water thing. Like there's like the George Foster Wallace thing about like the fish who swims up to their fish and it's like, hey boys, how's the water? And the other one's like, what's water? Yeah. That's how we're trained.
And it's interesting, doctor, and I've spent a lot of time talking to maternal health experts and Black women who have made their lives working on these issues. What is so unique about Black women in our healthcare system that Black women, not Latinx women, not Asian women, not other minority women, but Black women in particular, have these outrageous maternal death rates?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't paint any group of people as a monolith, of course, but clearly anti-Black racism is a very severe form of racism, and it's rooted in a very specific history, especially in the United States. The institution of medicine and slavery grew up at the same time. Like, you can't commoditize a human being and assign a value to them and their reproductive potential without, seeing them as not seeing their humanity, right? And so I think that there's a lot of things historically that have become entrenched in medicine that have just propagated into the future. And there are many examples of that. The primary one is that people with Black skin were regarded as biologically different, even though we're all the same biologically, in the most fundamental and important ways. And one of the ways that manifested itself in order to justify slavery as an institution was this idea that Black people experience pain differently. And nobody says that to you in a medical school lecture, but everything that you see reinforces this idea. Wow.
Give us some examples of that. Like, yes, they're not stating that overtly as a professor standing in front of a lecture class, but you said everything that you see in medical school reinforces that. Give us some examples of how it's reinforced.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so one thing is, just from a representation standpoint, most of what you see in textbooks, I guess less textbooks these days and more on screens, but it's white skin. When you're a brand new doctor in a hospital, you're not actually expected to know very much. The only thing that you're expected to do is know the difference between someone who looks sick and someone who doesn't, right? And so if you're one of my interns on my surgery floor, and I'm in the operating room, I need you to come back and report back to me if you think one of my patients is bleeding. And how do you know that? right? Like you look at someone and you think they're pale, but if you're melanated, you're not going to look pale in the same way.
Right.
And so that might lead to a delay in care. I also think, there's just this deep-seated implicit bias, really, that it's been shown repeatedly that when Black people and Black women in particular complain about symptoms that they're having, and especially pain, the healthcare system just is slower to respond. And that difference in time can make all the difference when it comes to life or death.
Yeah, you mentioned those textbooks, which are now obviously online, but we actually did a show because there was this image of a Black fetus that went viral.
That went viral. Yeah.
You probably saw that. And we actually did a whole show around it and had folks who are actually illustrators of medical books talk about how few African American and even any minority illustrators there are. And that because there's not representation, the notion of drawing fetuses and other anatomical parts, and make them reflect people of color was just something that never was done. Just historically had not been the case. Yeah,
it was never done. And I think, the way that race as a construct operates is that it makes people who are not white seem like the other, right? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when you would pull out this Crayola crayons and there would be one that said skin and you'd be like, what? Never question why Band-Aids are the color that they are, right? But when you see people as other, that starts to allow for people to not question a bunch of things that are just, one example that we talk about in the film, actually both films, is that there are a bunch of calculators that we use that quantitatively treat Black people differently, that I used in my practice and never questioned. One in particular, if someone has had a C-section the first time, they don't necessarily need a C-section for their next baby. But a lot of people are nervous the second time around, and they want to know, what are my odds of having a successful vaginal delivery? So you run them through a calculator where you put in their age, you put in their body mass index, and up until this year, you would put in their race. And if they were Black, it would drop their likelihood of having a successful vaginal delivery 10, 15 points. And you would subject them to potentially a needless surgery.
And what about that algorithm of that equation caused that 10 to 15 point drop because someone was Black?
That's the question, right? So what we've done historically, and this is really the answer to all the questions, is we've conflated race and racism, right? In every single scientific study in public health, there's a table 1 where you break down the demographics of the population that you're studying, and you talk about how many people were white, how many people were not white, usually. We look at that row and we're like, race is the variable. And we're not thinking that actually that's a proxy for racism. Fundamentally. So it is true. Black women are less likely to successfully have a vaginal delivery, but it's not because of biology. It's because they're less likely to be supported to have a vaginal delivery. And then it becomes this vicious cycle.
So that race wasn't code for underlying health conditions, diabetes, hypertension, had nothing to do with any kind of biological issues going on in Black women.
No, we have calculators for all kinds of things that we have historically broken down by race, like the way that your kidney filters toxins. Up until this year, there was a different cutoff for normal for people who are Black and people who are not, and that would basically gatekeep medications from Black people. And these are things in 2022 are still dominant parts of the practice. They're not edge cases. It's how most people in America are practicing.
So this is what was taught or is taught in medical schools across the country, including
and it's what was done.
Harvard, Yale, Stanford.
Yep, and it still is what is done in most cases.
Wow. So if you're a doctor coming out of medical school and you've learned, this is what you've been indoctrinated with for 4 years, and then you've gone on to a residency where a doctor that's in his 60s is teaching you or reinforcing that because that's what he was taught. And I'm saying he because most likely it's a he.
Yeah.
He, right? How do you ever break out of that? How do you get to the point where you are, where you recognize that race is a proxy for racism?
Have you read the book The Giver? There's an it's a like this classic children's book, but at the end, basically, like everybody sees in black.
I've read like every children's book in the world because I have 3 kids. So, yeah,
they're probably all swimming in your head. But there's a point at the end of the book where like the main character has only seen the world in black and white, and all of a sudden he sees color. And like it's a similar thing where like I just felt like, I didn't question any of this. And then what happened was, I think we started to have, well, first of all, I saw through the lens of maternal mortality, because I think that the well-being of moms is sort of a bellwether for the well-being of society as a whole. And so every injustice in our society shows up in the well-being of moms, whether it's gender inequity or racial inequity, geographic inequity. And so that was the lens through which I started my learning journey, I guess. And then as stories of Black moms dying got into the media, my patients started becoming my teachers. Oh. And they were telling me that, and then they were like, there was one case, I'll be very honest about this, where I was on the John Oliver show and I was talking about these issues. And then one of my patients came to me and they were like, Dr. Shah, I felt dismissed by you. And that was,
what did you say that made her feel dismissed?
I think, as I recall, she was pregnant and pregnancy is uncomfortable. And some of your job as an obstetricianist to normalize the discomforts of pregnancy. But I think, the thing is that what I have learned in the last couple of years is that doctors are sort of trained to attend to safety first and treat people's experience as a secondary luxury that you get to after I've made you safe. Mm-hmm. And what I'm learning and what the story of Black women in maternal health is showing is that we have that backwards. The way that you make people safe is actually by attending to their lived experience. Mm-hmm. So in that particular case, like, I'm sure I could have done more to make sure that she felt affirmed by me and really heard by me.
How was it for you you graduated from Harvard Medical School, right?
No. I went to Harvard. I trained at Harvard. Yeah.
So here you are, top medical school in the country. I'm sure feeling pretty good that you have a great education, and now having to learn, as you just said, from your patients, that so much of what you were taught dismissed them, marginalized them, made them feel invisible. How did you respond to that initially? Because a lot of people could have been very defiant. They could have been defensive, right? Like, hey, I went to Harvard. You don't tell me, I tell you, which is the attitude that a lot of folks like you and me who went to Harvard have. Unfortunately, we'll just own that. We know that our peers often have that kind of arrogance. But how is it that you were open to listening to what these women had to say?
I mean, I guess I thought it was my job, but also, a bad system will beat a good person every time. I think that's the thing. I mean, obviously, like when you're understanding that you haven't been taking good care of people, or as good care as you might want to, it's like gut wrenching. It's hard, right? We all want to be good people, but also there is a very important interpersonal dimension to racism, and there's a really important moral dimension to racism. And also, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And so I think part of what has been helpful to me is looking at it through a systems lens. It's really hard for people to engage in a dialogue when you're telling them that they're bad, right? We're all taught that racism is evil. And, I think if we're able to look at it through a more systems and structural lens, you can be like, oh, there are algorithms we have to go back and revisit. I will say my students taught me as much as my patients. I think, one thing that gives me a lot of hope as I, turned 40 recently and am entering that phase of life is that the 25-year-old students that were me when I decided to become an OB are the ones that are pushing me to do better and be better.
You make that distinction, Dr. Shah, between interpersonal and what you're calling institutional racism. And, in the last 18 months or so in this country, we've been having this conversation about institutional racism. And you just said you think it makes it easier when people think about race through systems rather than confronting individuals, because that gets personal and makes people recoil.
I think it's more productive. I mean, not more productive. I think you need to do both. But I think what happens often is that you tell people they're bad people, that they're bad, and then they just sort of clam up and then they don't engage and they can't learn, they can't progress.
And I would agree with you. And the racism we're talking about, to address it, we need to think about it structurally, not just on an individual level. But as you see, or as we all see over the last 18 months or so, and definitely over the last 5 or 6 months, the more we talk about structural and systemic racism, the greater the pushback is, because people then say, well, wait a minute, now you're saying that everything in this country is premised on race and gets thrown under this critical race theory umbrella. And we see this vicious attack. We see laws being enacted every day. I pick up the paper, reading the paper every day. There's some county, some state enacting some law preventing kids in school from learning about this umbrella term critical race theory, which we know is not taught in schools, but it's kind of a code for teaching about race on any level. And people saying, well, I don't want my kids to think that they did something wrong, or their ancestors did something wrong, or that there's someone to blame for racism. And there is someone to blame for slavery in this country. There are people, we can go back and identify them. So that's just a fallacy. But structural racism creates as much pushback as talking about it from a personal standpoint.
You know what? You're right. You're absolutely right. I agree with you. We shouldn't cast one versus the other in terms of what's easy. What we should do is recognize that racism pervades more than individuals. It also pervades systems and structures. And, I think it was Martin Luther King who said the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. Obama used to quote that phrase quite a bit. And it's because progress is messy, and so, some of the pushback probably means we're starting to get things right. I'll tell you, we started talking about the documentary, The Color of Care. There's another documentary that I participated in, Aftershock, that premiered at Sundance and hopefully will be on Hulu soon. And part of that film, they followed me and my team to Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is a case study in how systemic and structural racism works. We went to Tulsa and we were there on the 100th anniversary, the centennial of this thing called the 1921 Race Massacre.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we just happened to be there at the same time. And this is this episode of sordid racial violence that seems like it's in our distant past, right? Where an entire neighborhood was literally razed to the ground. And yet, the reason that we were in that neighborhood is because we were working with a hospital that serves the people who still live there a century later and still have the highest maternal mortality rate in Oklahoma. And it's because, the legs of racism are long. That same neighborhood suffered from structural divestment, which led to a hospital that was under-resourced, which led to more moms experiencing injury and even death during childbirth.
Right. Yeah, the Tulsa race riots, a part of U.S. history, American history, Black history that wasn't talked about until very recently. Most people weren't even aware that there was this thing called Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, this Greenwood community. So the atrocities that community experienced are becoming more known, at least more talked about, and now there's some efforts to rebuild that community. But Dr. Shah, you talk a lot about medical education. You just told us about how medical school in many ways reinforces these biases. Is the work that you're doing, or other doctors like you, is it having any impact on how medical students are being taught? Because you have data. You're not just making this up. You're not just, going from your gut or your emotions. You actually have data to support these biases. Is it reaching the deans? Is it reaching the folks that write the curriculum in medical schools?
It is. Yeah. I mean, like we talked about how progress is messy, but things that give me hope are, first of all, our students all know. They know. And, the way that medical school works, you spend a couple years in a classroom and then you get deployed into the hospital. And your job is to open every door inside the hospital and find out what happens inside, right? You're like an investigative reporter. That's what your job is as a medical student. That's how you learn. And they know. So that gives me hope. The other thing is that I think, just talking about the deans, and it's really, really hard to make progress when the people that are in leadership positions don't share lived experience with the people they're trying to serve. But that's starting to shift too. From editorial boards at journals to leaders of healthcare institutions, hospitals, medical schools. I'm seeing shifts in leadership that give me a lot of hope.
And I want to talk about some of the other work that you're involved in. You just became the chief medical officer of this innovative women's clinic, Maven. Tell us about the clinic and what work you're doing with them.
Yeah, sure. So about 7 months ago, I gave all my grants away. I took a leave from the university and I became the chief medical officer of a startup. And it was because it's a digital health company that's basically, people carry their phones in their pockets. They spend apparently like 7 hours a day of screen time looking at them. And an app isn't going to fix structural racism. But your phone could theoretically become a portal into a human healthcare service. And one of the things that bothers me the most, talking about Tulsa or even New York City, is that the neighborhood that you live in today in the United States is a big determinant of what you have access to. Right? You're 8 to 12 times more likely to die if you're Black and you live in New York City. And that's because of the difference between what you have access to in the Bronx or Jackson Heights, Queens, where my family is from, versus the Upper East Side. And so during the pandemic, I was seeing that and getting frustrated. And this opportunity came along to make that not the case, to give people access to healthcare in ways that are not dependent on where they live. And then to try to deploy it to people who need it the most. So I've been doing that for the last 7 months.
So is that a telehealth platform where anyone can log on and talk to a doctor no matter where they are in the country and get medical advice through the app?
No matter where they are and no matter what time of day it is. Because if you're a mom and you're struggling to breastfeed, you need help at like 3 a.m., and so you can make that happen if you, especially for people who are going through this phase of life where they're building their family, but really at any point in life. Even if you live in a city, right? Like if you live in Dorchester, right, you might have to take 3 city buses to come to my clinic, right? It is such a struggle, and especially if you've got a newborn infant. So yeah, that's essentially the idea.
And it caters only to moms? Is the app specifically for pregnant women and then after birth moms?
It is. It's for anyone it's for families. So it could include men too, and same-sex couples. But it's anyone who's sort of pre-contemplative about having a family through getting pregnant, having a pregnancy, having a baby, parenting an infant, and just going through that whole phase of life.
I want to ask you about, Oprah had a specific goal. I read that she wanted to foster through the Color of Care, this documentary aired on Smithsonian Channel. She wanted to foster a deeper understanding of what change needed to take place. Do you think documentaries like The Color of Care and the Hulu documentary that you're a part of, that it can be that catalyst for these important conversations, and not just the conversations, but actual change?
100%. I think the arts have a huge role to play. I think that media has a huge role to play, which is why I'm up here with you first thing in the morning. And I'm really grateful to you for providing this platform and for the work that you do. But I'll be honest with you. So I went to the premiere for Sundance got canceled because of COVID. Right. And then we did kind of like a secret premiere in New York City for Aftershock. And they filmed for about a year and they turned it into 90 minutes. So I had no idea what it was going to be, right? Like these cameras sort of like followed us around for like a long time. And I watched it and I was so nervous to see myself on a screen. And the filmmakers they're artists. They did such a beautiful job that I couldn't even I was like, that's me. I'm an awkward professor, but it wasn't about me. It was really the families that they centered, how powerful they are. And as gut-wrenching as the subject matter was, I left with a lot of hope. And I think that once this film gets out into Hulu, people are going to watch what Bruce and Omari did after they lost their partners, and they're going to think that they can do it too. Yeah. I know with The Color of Care, there's going to be a website, thecolorofcare.org. There's a whole impact campaign. Yeah. And I know that one of Oprah and Yance's intention is actually to aim it directly at students and to try to use this as a teachable moment. And I think it's going to be very powerful.
Yeah, I know. I read that historical Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, is one of the targets for Oprah in terms of getting this information out to those students and getting those students involved. I think I read, and you can correct me, that only 4% of doctors in this country are African American, 2% are African American female. Is that the stat?
That's right. Yeah.
So we got a representation problem. And I know you talk a lot about deficits in medical school. How do we change that? How do you get more Black students in particular into medical schools?
That's a good question. And, it's not my expertise, but I think one thing that's really clear to me from mentoring the few Black medical students that we have at Harvard, one of whom I'm really proud of, is about to graduate, and I've had the chance of working closely with her for 5 years. I think, yeah, and she's actually my example of the student who's continually pushing me. But I wrote a book on something called value-based healthcare. I wrote a whole book, and she was like, "Neel, where's the chapter on equity?" and then we wrote.
I love it.
Yeah, and I was like, "It's a great question." And then we wrote an article that she led.
So that's book 2, right?
Yeah, maybe it has to be another book. But I think there's better people than me can tell us how we get people into the pipeline at all stages. But I do know that when medical students show up, it's not enough to admit people to medical school. You have to validate their concerns, listen to them, and provide support and space. I remember when the George Floyd murder happened, and it was in the news, and the whole nation was shocked. And I'm not going to out her, but the student was like we were in a group meeting on Zoom because it was during the pandemic. And I remember saying out loud that police violence is a public health issue. And I remember the look on her face when I said that, and how important it was to just take a pause, right? And not just sort of roll into our agenda for the meeting, but just know that, she was feeling that differently from the white students in front of me.
I was going to ask you, how did the white students respond to that comment? Because that could be one of those triggering comments when you say that police violence is a public health crisis. I believe it, you believe it, but that may not be the belief of white students, depending on their geographics, depending on their upbringing, depending on how much history they have of systemic and structural racism.
I think it's tough. I mean, I think you just have to provide space and do your best to create safe spaces. I'll be honest with you. I think a lot of nurses in the greater Boston area are married to cops, and they're staffed at hospitals where they're treating a lot of people of color. And there were really different political viewpoints around that. And it really came to a flashpoint that summer, and around a lot of what we were seeing around COVID. A lot of, Black families were coming into hospitals in labor and seeing actual police blocking their people from coming with them because that was a COVID rule, right? And it was reinforcing some of that trauma in real time. And it was really tough.
Yeah, and Boston has such an ugly history. I mean, the racism, South Boston, and that, that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah, but that was the dynamic. That was
I've lived there. I know that Cambridge is kind of a bubble. You don't feel it as much, but when you go into that city, and the race relations have improved dramatically. A woman of color is now the mayor of Boston. And there was a Black woman who was temporarily the mayor of Boston when Marty Walsh went to the White House. So a lot of history in Boston with race relations. But you mentioned, I want to ask you briefly before I let you go about this study that came out about a month ago that said that white people have a negative response to COVID when they believe that COVID is a Black person's disease disorder. Did you see that study? There were some researchers who looked at how white people responded to COVID and their reaction. Oh,
I did see something. This may be what you're talking about. And I just read about it in the news. I didn't read the study, but I saw a headline about how it was something like they're more likely to be dismissive of COVID.
Yes.
And like less likely to be empathetic.
They were more likely to be in favor of protocols or of mediation type strategies because it wasn't a white person's problem, essentially, is what they were saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really consistent with the way that race operates and what race was designed for, right? Because race isn't a real thing. I mean, people's lived experiences are, and there's different genetic pools and stuff. But race was like very specifically constructed to make people different and other. And And that's such a deeply seated idea everywhere we look that, of course, if you're like, yeah, COVID is disproportionately impacting people of color, you're like, well, that's not me. I think, race is really set up to separate us. And I think one of the reasons we saw it so clearly during COVID, because it was a moment where we really needed to be able to come together and take care of each other. And it became very hard because, we weren't just separated along geopolitical borders. We were separated in really stark terms in the hospital. Like, you would see who was coming in and getting sick. You could see.
Yeah. No, I saw that study and it just blew my mind. Like, maybe speaking out loud what perhaps I had already been feeling, and I think I had articulated it to someone privately, and then to see that it was confirmed in a study. It's disheartening. We've made a lot of progress, but obviously a lot more to go. And so I'll ask you this: what efforts have you seen since you've been, working in this area, trying to address disparities? What are you most hopeful about?
We talked about a lot of things that give me hope. But I think one is that I see, first of all, this conversation that we're having is a different conversation than I think we might have been having a couple of years ago. That John Oliver thing, that was a clip. He used a clip that I went on like a stodgy, or maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but I went on like a stodgy network TV news show, like a Sunday morning show, and said things about racism in America in like 2018. And it was a lightning rod, right? Like the next day, my inbox was like colleagues feeling like I was calling them racist and like, all this stuff. And now it's like nobody would question it, right? And I think in the struggle for progress, sometimes because it's messy, we can lose hope. But if you step back, fundamentally, this dialogue that we're having right now and that we're having more broadly as a country is really good for America.
And you're hopeful that these kinds of dialogues will lead to real change, real action?
Yes, because I've seen it. And I've seen it just over a couple of years. But, generationally, my grandparents grew up in a colony. And the reason that I'm in the United States is because my parents were looking for progress and opportunity. And so I've seen it. My grandparents were amazed by what they found in this country in terms of the potential for progress. And in the last couple of years, I think it's not just that we're talking the talk. I do see signs that we're walking the walk. We have a lot of work to do ahead, but for sure.
And what do you think is the single most important thing that could be done to impact the maternal death rates for Black women? Like, what if you had a magic wand as a doctor? What's that single most important thing that could make childbirth a joyous, a life-fulfilling, happy experience where you're not worried about, am I going to die just by doing something so natural as having a baby?
Fundamentally, it's we've treated childbirth as a disease, and we see it through that lens. But we could make the entire enterprise of giving birth much better if we, rather than indexing towards surgeons like me, really focused on supporting people. And to support people well, you have to know them, you have to affirm them, you have to listen to them. And every person deserves that. But we seem to be much worse at doing that for people of color and Black people in particular. And if we did that, it seems so simple, right? There's like, you don't need an algorithm to fix this. You don't need an AI. You don't need a fancy technology. It's literally as simple as listening to people and affirming them. And the solutions already live in the Black community, right? People have been saying these same things. Part of what gives me hope too, though, is that communities are starting to organize and push back. The reason that we're having a national dialogue and the White House is talking about the Black maternal mortality crisis is because of community activists and their energy. Yeah, definitely want to give a lot of credit to those activists. I've had an opportunity to interview a lot of them, and their work, that on the ground, boots on the ground work, is definitely made its way to the White House, to policymakers, hopefully to medical schools, and is having an impact. Thank you so much, Dr. Shah. I just want to remind folks again, he's a part of two really important documentaries, Aftershock, which is going to be out soon, hopefully on Hulu, and Color of Care, which is already out on the Smithsonian Channel. Make sure you check out both of these, learn more about
these topics, and follow Dr. Shah because he's doing groundbreaking work. And good luck with the clinic or the tele clinic, the tele platform, the Maven platform that you are part of. Really great way to again address disparities is give people, the tools that they need where they are going to find them, mostly, which we know, like you said, 7 hours on our phone, so people can get connected to good health care that way. That's pretty amazing. Again, thank you, Dr. Shah. I'm going to watch you. I don't know what's next for you. Probably some big screen movie or something. I don't know. Life of Dr. Neel Shah perhaps is coming out.
I don't know about that, Areva, but thank you so much again for the opportunity to talk about this issue that I know is really important to you and it's definitely important to me. And it's been great to have this conversation.
All right. Well, maybe not that movie, but the book on equity. Okay. Maybe.
Sounds good. That's a deal.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you again. All right. Wow, what an interesting interview. I just love Dr. Shah. I love the work that he's doing. I love his energy and I love his approach. This isn't easy work. Talking about equity, talking about race, talking about structural racism when you are a Harvard-trained doctor. And as he said in 2018, when he went on national television and made comments about racism and structural racism in the healthcare field, he got a lot of pushback. And that's what happens when you talk about these subjects. But I love that he had the courage to stay with it, because if we're going to change it, we have to acknowledge it and we have to talk about it. And we can't run scared just because some Neanderthals, people who are stuck in the past, people who want to maintain the status quo, don't like it. And yes, people like me, people like Dr. Shah, we get a lot of hate mail. We get a lot of pushback on social media. We get attacks even from our friends, some family members, and definitely colleagues. But that should not, and in my case, does not deter me from continuing to raise these issues, because I am hopeful, like Dr. Shah, that if we continue to press forward, we continue to talk about these issues, we will start to see change, and we are starting to see change. And change is slow, it's incremental, but progress is progress. And remember, progress is not perfection. So you can't grow weary with this work, because this is work that's going to take decades and decades and decades. So we stand on the shoulders of pioneers dating back to slavery that have been working for the liberation and freedom of Black folks. And they did it under far worse conditions than we today have to do this work. So again, just a shout out to Dr. Shah for being a part of this work and the struggle. And my words to live by, I'm thinking of what Hillary Clinton once said when she said, it takes a village. And yes, Dr. Shah is not African-American. He said he's from India, his family's from India, but he is a part of this village. And everybody can play a part in this village. Doesn't matter if you're Black, you're brown, you're white. We need all hands on deck, because if we're going to address structural and systemic racism in this country, it's going to take this thing called a village. Be safe out there, and remember, we're all in this together.